Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to do some exercises for reduce. Reduce was a bit tricky, so I made sure to make a bunch of exercises for us to get a bunch more practice, since this is definitely one of the most challenging of the three functional methods on arrays. Let's get right into it. Okay, so as with other videos, kind of the same deal. I have a bunch of files ready for us to go. I have a bunch of comments at the top of each file where I'll read through all the instructions for the exercise, and then we will try it out together after you have a chance to give it a shot. So for this one, we want to create an array called points with the numbers 55 to 60 inclusive. Then we want to create a variable called sum using reduce that sums up the points inside of points, and we want to print out both points and the sum. I'll give you a moment to try that out yourself, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so we want to create an array. We'll call it points, and this is going to have numbers 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 60, because we want to do inclusive. So once we have that, we want to create another array called sum. And this is going to be, actually I shouldn't say array, we want to create another variable called sum, and this is going to be using reduce over the points array. So we're going to say points.reduce, and reduce takes two arguments. It takes a function, which we'll fill in the parameters for in a second, as well as a starting value. And since we're doing a sum in this case, it makes sense to start the starting value at 0. We want to create two variables for the parameters here. I'll call this, I'll go with maybe result and the point. And result is going to start at 0, and it's going to keep accumulating as we go through this loop of reduces, and point is going to be each point in this list as we go through them one at a time. So to sum these up, we want to take the result, which is going to start at 0, but it's going to keep accumulating, and we want to add the point to it. We want to return them together, so that we'll start at 55, then we'll add 55 to 56, and then we'll have 111, I think that is, and then we'll add 57 to that, etc., all the way to the end. Math can be tricky in your head, especially. So I'll pull up my terminal, I'll do node, and I'll do the warm-up exercise. And as usual, I forgot to console log out my sum. So let me rerun that one more time, and we get our 345. Okay, so just to show that this really is working as intended, if I add, like, let's say 100 to this, then we should see 100 added to this number, and if I run this, we get 445, right? So try to wrap your mind around how this is working. We went through this in the previous video where we looked at reduce in detail and how it works, so if you need a refresher on that, definitely check that video out. Let's go to exercise 1. Okay, so for this one, let's create an array called companies with the following companies in it, a bunch of strings. Then we want to create a const called modded that reduces the companies array to a string of companies that do not start with the letter A. And then we want to separate all these companies out with dashes. So we would have like Tesla dash SpaceX, and I have an example of the result right here. We want to print out both of them. So the result looks like this, right? I'll give you a moment to try that out together as well. You notice that there's a bonus in here as well, and this is really to get you in the practice of kind of Googling for things and using documentation such as MDN, which is a really great JavaScript web documentation. As a bonus, if you have want extra practice, definitely see if you can figure out a way to get rid of the trailing dash, which is this one right here, so that we only have Tesla dash SpaceX dash Meta dash Google without this final slash. I'll give you a moment to try that out. Okay, so I'm going to create a const called companies, and I'm just going to copy this array right here. Sorry for having you write it out. And I want to create a const called modded, and we want to take companies and we want to reduce over it. So I'm going to set that up. This is going to be a function, and then we want to return a string as our final result. So we're going to give an empty string as our starting kind of seed value for this reduce loop. Then reduce is going to take two arguments really that we're going to be given to us by the reduce method. I'll just call this maybe result and company singular. Okay. Technically, we could probably say something like concatenated companies, but I'll just keep it short for this video so we can reduce the amount of typing that we do. But generally, you want this to be something a bit more explanatory. A lot of people will do something like this, accumulator. Result is a common kind of generic one, or previous value or something like that. But in this case, it probably makes more sense to say like concatenated, concat companies or something, right? Now, but I'll just leave it at result for now. Okay, so inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to concatenate these companies together with dashes, but with the added complexity of not only trying to get rid of all the companies that start with the letter A, but potentially even get rid of the trailing slash or dash, sorry. So I'll start by just doing all the companies concatenated together. So we want to return result plus company. But we want there to be a dash in between, right? We kind of, how are we going to kind of accomplish this, right? And we can probably add a dash at the end like that. Let's see if that works. So if I do node and I do exercise 1, I always forget to log out my variable every single time. If I do node exercise 1, it looks like that kind of works, right? So we have the result, which starts as empty. We take the company, and right after company, we add the dash after it. So that works to get everything in there, including the A's. But how do we get rid of Apple and Amazon, right? So we need an if statement in here to filter something out. So we're going to do an if statement, and we're going to say that if the company, and we did this in a previous video where we looked at how strings have a starts with method on them, where we can check to see if a string starts with a letter or another string, in this case an A. So we're asking if company starts with A, which is going to return true or false, then we want to return result plus company, right? Just like that. So hopefully this works. Let's try it out. So if I run this, oh no, we get undefined. So we went through this again in the previous video, but just to kind of recap that really quick, by default, every single JavaScript function returns undefined. We don't want this because this is what gets put into the next accumulator or the next result for the next iteration of reduce. And undefined is just always going to end up undefined when you do something with it. So we just end up doing undefined plus something, which is not what we want. So we want to be very careful to explicitly only return what we want in every single case, which in this case, if we're not, if we don't return with the letter A, I kind of have this reversed. So if the company starts with A, we actually don't want to return it like this. We want to have this out here, and then we want to in here, only if it starts with A, we want to return just the result by itself, so that we don't actually have any dashes added to it or any company added to it. So we just kind of pass through that result to the next iteration in the case of A. I could have made this not and work with and left it the way it was, but I'll just keep it simple like this. So you can see we're always returning something in this case. We're never returning undefined because we have a return statement here. And if we fail that, then we return here. So if I run that, we should see that we get Tesla, SpaceX, Meta, and Google, which is what we want. Perfect. So if you had a chance, the bonus is kind of tricky, right? If you looked at the documentation online for how this works, for reduce, that's probably the easiest way to go about it. So let's look at that together. So I have Google opened up here, and I'm just going to look for JavaScript reduce. And my favorite documentation is this one, reduce for MDN, array prototype reduce. If we click on that, we get to their docs, and we can kind of look through here to see if there's something that might help us. So we kind of want to tell how are we at the last element in this list. So if you just Google for that, you might have found it, but if you scroll down a little bit, you can see that reduce actually has some other parameters that it actually allows. And you can see they kind of have examples here, but then they also have the actual literal parameters right here as well. They also have the return value. This is why MDN is very, very useful. Right now, we're passing it this parameter, which is the callback function, and this parameter, which I mentioned is optional, but we should always use, which is the initial value. Inside the callback function, it also has its own parameters. We're using these two right now, which are the previous value and the current value. The previous value in our example is this one right here, where we have result, and our current value is company. So we have basically result and we have company for our example. However, we probably want to figure out how are we at the last element in this array, right? And I'll give you a hint. We're going to need index. So now that I've given you that hint, try to think about it for a moment and see how you could use this value to actually make it work. Okay, so the third parameter, and there's also a fourth parameter that we can use, but the third parameter to reduce and also for map and filter is actually the index. And it starts at 0 and goes all the way up to the array's length -1. So I'll show you how that works. So we can do I here for index as the third parameter to this reduce function that's getting called for us every single time. We already have the first two filled in, which are the required ones, but this index is optional. We can spell it out, but I'll just leave it nice and concise so it fits on my screen. Okay, so with this index, what do we actually want to do and how can we use it? We want to ask a question, are we at the last element inside of this array? And if we are, kind of as we're looping through reduce, can we not add this dash at the end, right? Can we only add the dash for these other elements, but not the sixth element, right? So for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, add the dash. For 6, don't add the dash. But since we're using indexes, we are going to have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this is going to be 5. So we're going to ask if we're on index 5, don't add the dash, otherwise add the dash. So we're going to say if I is equal to 5, then don't add the dash. What does that mean? Well, that means return just result plus company with no dash, right? And if we're not index 5 and we don't start with A, which is what we want, then we want to add the dash. Okay, this is quite complex. There's a lot happening here. This is why I put it as a bonus. But if you walk through this logic, it should slowly start to make sense. I'll just show you what this looks like really quick. And I'll clear the console and run this. And you can see that now we don't have the dash for Google. However, there's one improvement we can make right here. You notice that I've hard coded this to be 5. This is generally not good, because like what happens, for example, if we add like say IBM in here, right? And my thing is going to get formatted to keep on in a nice part of the screen here. But if we ignore that, if we added one more company to the end here, for example, IBM, and I try to rerun this code, what we'll see is something weird. Right? We're going to have Tesla, SpaceX, Meta, Google, IBM, and then still a dash at the end, right? So this is why I always mention, avoid using hard-coded values. Always try to use like something that's dynamic, right? So in this case, what do we mean by 5? What's the intention behind the number 5? Well, we were asking the question, the last element inside of the company's array, right? So the way to do that is to say if I is equal to companies.length -1. And the reason we have to -1 is because when we ask for companies.length, we're going to get, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? But indices start at 0, right? So the last index is always the length -1. All right, so let's see if this works. And indeed it does, right? And we can add more companies in here and it would still work as intended. Okay, perfect. Let's go to the second exercise. So for this one, we want to create an array called prices, and we want to have a bunch of prices in there. Then we want to create a constant called after tax that does a sum over the prices with a certain condition. If the price is greater than 6, we want to add the price with no tax. But if it's less than 6, then we can add the price with a tax included of 20%. Okay, so if anything is greater than 6, then we want to just add the price without any tax, right? And if it's less than 6, then we want to add a tax of 20%. So in this case, we want to add a tax to 1.23 to 5.2, and then we want to leave these middle values without any tax. So give that a shot and see what you can come up with. Okay, so I'm going to create my array called prices to start. And it's going to look like this. Then I'm going to say prices, or actually I'll create after tax, sorry, constant after tax is tax is equal to prices.reduce, and we're going to give it a function, and we want to give it a starting value, right? So in this case, we're creating a sum. So with a sum, we are probably going to want to start at 0 because we want to create some number, some numeric value. So I'll name my kind of reduce variables here appropriately, just so that it's a bit more clear as to kind of what we're actually working with. So this first one I'll call sum, and the second one I'll just call the price. We don't need the index in this case, but if you did want to, now you can see how we would include that as we saw in the previous exercise. So we want to ask the question, is the price that we're currently looking at greater than 6? So is the price greater than 6, which is this condition right here, right? If the price is greater than 6, then we want to add the price with no tax. Okay, so that means that we want to basically take the previous sum that we've summed up so far and just add the price directly to it without adding a tax first. So to do that, we want to return the sum that we've accumulated so far as we're looping through this list, and we want to just directly add the price with no tax. In the case of, the only other case in this case actually is the other case, which is if it's less than 6, right, or equal to 6, and we want to add the price plus a tax of 20%. So if we have that case, then we want to return sum plus, and then we want to do the price multiplied by 1.2, okay, just like this. So the reason we want to do this is because if we multiply price by 1.2, we're basically saying take that price and add a 20% tax to it and give us back the total price. And then we're adding that to our sum, which is what we're going through every single iteration of this loop all along. Okay, so this is always going to be a larger value than this because we're adding a 20% tax on top. Definitely a bit of a tricky one. This is getting more tricky as we go through them, but try to rationale behind the reason, try to find the rationale behind what's actually happening here as it's doing the loop. So if I pull up my terminal here, I'll just run node and then I'll run exercise 2. And as usual, I always forget to log my after tax. I'm sorry about that, but it's going to happen every single time. And it looks like we get this final result. Okay, so this should be the result of adding all of these together. However, adding a 20% tax to 1.23 and the 5.2 right here. Okay, and we're leaving these ones intact where we're not adding any tax to them. Okay, perfect. So let's go to the third exercise. For this one, we want to create an array called items. It's going to have 5 strings in it, these strings right here. We want to then create an array called caps that maps over items and capitalizes each item. So this is going to be tricky. If you haven't seen the maps video yet, I encourage you to see that if you're not sure with how array maps works. Then we want to create a const called concat that uses reduce to concatenate all the strings inside of the caps array that we just created using maps. And we want to separate each of these items with a space instead of like a dash like we did in the company's example. Then we want to print out all of these arrays just to see what they all look like. And as a bonus, and this is quite challenging, see if you can do all of these steps in one line without creating constants in between, only the one variable to start, or only the one constant to start called items. Okay, so let's go through this and let's start with items. So we're going to say const items is equal to this array right here of strings. And then I'm going to create another array called caps. So I'm going to say const caps is equal to items. And we're not going to reduce over this, right? For items, we want to map over them and capitalize each item. So we're going to do map. Map takes a function. We don't need an initial value for map because it just takes every single value one at a time and we return what we want to put in that spot, which is what we looked at in the maps video. So we're going to get each item one at a time. What do we want to do? We want to take that item and transform it to be uppercase. So also in a previous video, we looked at how to do that with strings, but I encourage you to Google that if you haven't found it so far, something like string uppercasing JavaScript, and you should be able to find it on MDN or any other documentation. But we want to do item dot to uppercase, just like that. We do want to make sure to return this though, because if we don't return it, we'll be returning undefined in that array spot. So that's step 2. This is going to take each item and then uppercase it, and then it's going to return that into caps. So we're going to have capitals of light, banana, phone, book, and mouse. And all caps, the entire string is going to be capitalized. So step 3, we want to create another const called concat that uses reduce now to concatenate all the strings inside of this array that we just made, caps, right? And we want to separate each of the strings with a space. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. So we're going to say const concat, and this is going to take caps.reduce. Reduce is going to take a function, and we're going to give it an initial value. So this is the tricky part. What initial value do we give reduce? And in this case, we want the final result to be a concatenated string. So we're going to give it an empty string to start so that we can start adding to it as we go along. We also want to fill in the parameters here. So in this case, I'll just call this, let's just say result and each string. And as we're getting the strings, we want to add them to result, but with a space in between. Okay, so we want to return result plus the string plus a space in between. Okay, so we're going to take the string, we're going to add a space to the end, and we're going to take the next string and add a space to the end, and then keep doing that repeatedly until we have every single string separated by a space. There's going to be one space at the end, but that's okay for the purposes of this exercise. Let's print all these out. So we'll do console.log of items, and then I'll do, getting a little bit further down the screen here, console.log of items, caps, and concat. Okay, so if I run this, let's see what we get. We're going to do node exercise-3, and look at that, right? That's pretty amazing. Honestly, that's really, really nice to see. Every single time I do this, no matter how many times, I always love to see these results. So here we have our initial array, right? Light, banana, phone, book, and mouse. Then we uppercase it, which is caps, which is what we're doing right here, right? So this is uppercasing each of those strings using map, and it's still an array, right? Then finally, we're using reduce on this array, this one that we created, to concatenate them all together as a string separated by spaces. This is no longer an array. This is actually a string, which is pretty awesome, right? So as you can see, this transformation happen kind of line by line. Now the bonus for this was to do this all in one line. Now this is gonna be pretty intense, so if you didn't get this, don't worry, but I just wanna show you how this might work. What we can do is we can actually chain these together. We saw this in a previous exercise as well with filter, but I wanna show you how this will work in this example, and we'll kind of ramp it up in the bonus as well. So I'll close this just to make sure we're focusing on the code. I'm actually going to take map, and I'm going to, instead of creating this variable right here, I'm going to directly apply it to this array. So I'm going to say, take this array and directly map over it like this, okay? And we're going to return each item.toUppercase. I'm actually going to do the same thing with this. I'm just going to get rid of this part right here, and I'm going to move it up here and get rid of this semicolon and kind of just fix these tabs a little bit just so it's a bit more clear as to what's happening. And now you can see that we're taking the original input array, we're getting rid of those intermediary variables because we're not really using them, and we're directly mapping over it. This is going to give us back the uppercase version as an array, and then we're immediately taking that and reducing over it, and this is going to give us back the final result, which is a string, which is going to be what items is going to be pointing at as a final result. So I can actually get rid of these because I don't have those variables anymore. And now if I run this code, we'll actually see that we do get the same result, which is absolutely amazing. And this is really where the power of functional programming and the ideas of map, filter, and reduce start to come in, and why they're so used in modern JavaScript. So this definitely is quite complex. Again, if you didn't get this right away, don't worry about it. Try to read through this and understand what's happening. The main thing is to know that we're taking an array, we're manipulating it here, we get back the manipulated array, then we're directly putting it into the next thing, and we can keep piping these things into each other to do whatever it is that we need to, as long as the types match. Since maps gives us back an array, we can do any array.reduce, and that's totally okay. All right, cool. So let's go to the bonus exercise. As I said, I love these functions, so I had to create a bonus exercise for this one as well. All right, so we're gonna get really crazy with this one. For this one, I'd like you to create an array called nums, and it's going to look like this. It's going to have these 5 numbers in it. Then I want you to create another array called squares that maps over nums and returns each item squared. So squared just means multiplied, not by itself, kind of multiplied by itself, technically, not by 2. So if we had 2 squared, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 squared, 3 times 3 is 9, etc. Right? Then we want to create another new array called over 1000. That's going to take squares and filter it so that we keep only the values that are over 1000. And we kind of get rid of, or we filter out all the values under 1000. Okay. For step 4, we want to create another variable called finale that reduces over the over 1000 variable, and we create a sum of its elements. So we get back actually a number instead of an array. And then we finally want to print out all of these arrays. And as a bonus, just like the previous exercise, we want to see if we can do this all kind of in one series of statements, kind of in one line, quote unquote. Okay, not really one line per se, but technically it is one line, but one series of statements, just like we saw right here with our third exercise, right? This is technically one line, but it's split up over multiple lines. All right, so give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. This one's pretty gnarly, so take your time with it. Okay, so I'm going to create const nums. This is going to be this array right here. Then I'm going to say const squares, and we're going to take nums and we're going to map over it. And map is going to take a function. We're going to get each number in this function and we want to square it. So we want to return that number to the power of 2. And you can also just do num times num, whichever it's easier for you to understand. Next, what we want to do is, let's actually console log this as we go. So we'll say console log squares. Okay, and right here, I'll console.log nums. I'll make sure that this is working. I'll say node, and then bonus exercises, and it looks like we're good to go, right? We have the numbers, and then we have the numbers squared, which is fantastic. So step 3 is to take this array that we just created and create another array called over 1000 that filters squares to only contain the numbers over 1000. So in this case, these 3 numbers. We want to filter out 100. Ooh, my goodness. We want to filter out 100 and 900. Okay, so let's do that. So I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to say const over 1000, and this is going to equal to, we're going to take squares, and we're going to do a dot filter. And filter is going to take a function very similar to map, right? We saw this in the previous videos. And we're going to get each number, and we want to return true if we want to keep it, and return false if we want to filter it out. So if the number is greater than 1000, then we want to return true. Otherwise, we want to return false. Okay, and then let's console this out and see if we have the correct numbers. So we should see only these last 3 numbers in the case of filter, and we do, right? So that's filtering out the 100 and the 900 from that previous array of squares. Now the final step is to create another const called finale that reduces over 1000 and creates a single sum of its elements. So we want to add up all these numbers together to get a single number as a sum. So let's do that. So I'm going to say const finale, and this is going to take over 1000, and we're going to do a reduce. It takes a function and it takes an initial value. So for this one, the initial value is going to be a 0 because we want to do a sum, right? And that's going to be reduced to a single number. So we want to do 0 plus 2500 plus 4900 plus 8100. That's what we want to do. So we're going to start it at 0. Start our sum at 0, and we want to take the numbers and add them to each other. So I'll actually say sum here instead of results, so you can see how that will work with a new variable name. And I'm going to get each number, sum and num. Okay. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to return the sum plus the num, right? We want to take 0 plus 2500. Then we want to take 2500 plus 4900, whatever those two add up together are. And then we want to finally add 8100 to that and finally see the result. So I'll console log out finale, and let's see what we get. Okay, awesome. Look at that. So we get 15,500, which is the result of this entire series of operations, okay, where we have these numbers being added to each other. I trust my computer is doing the right math. That looks about right to me. Okay, it is pretty remarkable, right? There's a lot going on here. Again, if this took you a bunch of time, don't worry. As long as you're slightly following along the logic and each of these independently makes sense, eventually it'll make sense to chain these together. Now for the bonus, I asked if we could do this kind of all in like quote unquote one line, right? But really this is kind of over multiple lines, but technically like one statement is the correct way to say it. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we're going to kind of change this code slightly so that we don't have these intermediary variables of squares and over 1000 and finale. And this is the beauty of this functional programming style. So let's take a look at this. So I'm going to actually delete this code right here. I'm going to do a dot map. I'm going to get rid of this semicolon. So we're saying take this array, map over it, and then return this value, just like that. I'm going to do the same for this. I'm going to get rid of over 1000 right here. And I'm going to kind of move this over and get rid of this as well, right? And I'm going to do the exact same for the reduce. I'm going to get rid of this variable, the console log. Just going to move it over so it looks nice and get rid of the semicolon. Okay. If I save, I think it'll actually move my code around a bit, but I want to console log nums right here because I don't have finales anymore. Okay. Oops. And then there's a dot reduce. Okay, so be careful with the dots and be careful with the semicolons, especially when you're kind of refactoring your code or changing your code after you write it to kind of match this kind of style. We're still doing this array and then dot mapping over it. We're getting back another array and then we're dot filtering over it. Then we're getting back another array and we're dot reducing over it, and then we finally get back a number. Okay, so if I run this, let's see what we get. Look at that, right? That is pretty amazing. Honestly, I am like internally jumping for joy every time I see this kind of stuff. It's really, really awesome to see these functional programs work the way that they do in this case. This is really, really, really powerful, right? Before I wrap this up, I just kind of want to go through this in English so that it makes sense at a very, very high level as to why you would ever do this, because this seems just totally nutty, right? A map is taking a bunch of values and kind of manipulating them or changing them or modifying them in some way. Okay, so a practical example of this would be, let's say if you have like a store and each item in the store has a price, you can map over every single price and like do something to it, right? Discount them or add some tax or whatever happens to be. Filter just keeps values or gets rid of values. So for example, we can say like get rid of all the super expensive items, or get rid of the really, really cheap items, or get rid of items that are in between some values, right? And if we do these together, we can do something like, well, add a bunch of tax or discount the items and then get rid of the really, really expensive items, right? That's how you could think about it in English. Reduce allows us to take an array and then reduce it to a single value. In this case, we're reducing it to a number. So to go back to the example that we just thought about, we could say map is going to add a bunch of tax or discounts. Filter is going to get rid of, say, the expensive or the cheaper items. And then reduce is going to maybe give us a final total or an inventory count or something like that. Right? So there are many, many cases in the real world where you'd use this, and we're just scratching the surface. But I hope these exercises help you get more practice with this, because really it just takes a lot of practice to get used to these, especially when you start combining them together like this. So I hope you found this video valuable for extra practice with Reduce. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. As well, I'd love to hear in the comments of kind of what you thought of these exercises, and if you kind of want more exercises like this, and if you enjoyed them and want more practice, or really any other solutions that you came up with. I think coming up with different solutions to these is really, really important, and sharing them with each other really helps people understand what's happening. And I always learn from other people and their own solutions as well. This is just one way to do it, and I'm always surprised by other new ways to kind of achieve the same thing using especially these functional methods. So that said, in the next video, what we're going to do is go through a new concept in JavaScript called objects. And very similar to how we learned about arrays, we're going to learn about the basics of this object type, which is a new type in JavaScript and a very fundamental and important type that is going to kind of open the door to a lot of new fancy behavior so that we can keep track of items in a brand new way. I can't wait to get to that video. I'll see you later.